Hey Beer Geeks, this week we're taking a deep dive into the cool ship of lambic.
So Johnny, what even is lambic beer, mate? I mean, I know it's sour, we talk about sour beers a lot on the channel, and I know it's from Belgium, but what is it specifically about lambic that makes it different from all other sour beers?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key thing. It's a great place to start. Like, it's a very separate thing to the sour beers that we often talk about. Particularly in like modern craft beer, we've got these quick sours, lots of heavily fruited sours, Berliner Weisses, Goses. All of that we need to put aside because lambic is its own thing. And I'm not even sure really that sourness is the key component and the best way to understand this incredibly unusual style. So all of those beers, those quick sours that we talk about, are made in a really simple way, which is that you use what's essentially a yogurt culture, it's lactobacillus, to lower the pH, which is all sourness is, of the beer, of the wort, and then you ferment it, turn it into beer, add fruit, add salt, add coriander, whatever it is, and sell it.
Bob's your uncle.
So the difference with lambic is that rather than have the brewer add the lactobacillus, add the brewer's yeast, everything happens completely naturally.
Wild.
With a lambic beer. Exactly, it's a wild beer.
Right.
Or as we probably call more specifically lambics, spontaneous beer.
Okay.
So with most beer, you boil it with the hops, you chill it down really, really quickly and add your yeast to avoid any infections because infections happen at higher temperatures.
Yep.
With lambic, rather than chill it down really quickly, what they do is they chill it slowly overnight, naturally, in these giant basins in Belgium at the top of the breweries.
Right.
And that's what's called the cool ship.
So the cool ship is kind of like a swimming pool that the wort hangs around in and cools down very slowly.
Yeah.
And all the wild yeast in the area can come down and descend upon it and have a party.
It's a beer pool party. It's the ultimate beer pool party.
Come on.
Yeah. So all these wild yeasts and wild bacteria are getting into this liquid and then they siphon it off into barrels where it starts to ferment using all those wild and natural bacteria.
Amazing.
So using a cool ship doesn't actually guarantee you're going to get a really funky beer. In fact, there's IPAs made with cool ships. There's a couple of breweries in the UK that do that. What kind of guarantees that you're going to get some funk is a technique called the turbid mash.
Right.
Which happens before you cool this beer. So what happens in a mash usually is you just combine your water and your grain at a certain temperature. It releases the sugars that you can ferment later. With a turbid mash, it's like a 4 or 5 hour ordeal where you combine the water and the malted barley and also lots of wheat.
Yes.
And instead of just having it at one temperature or a couple of different steps, what you do is you take some of the mash back out, superheat it and add it and slowly ramp up the temperature of that mash. There's not many fermentable sugars left over in that superheated bit that you put back in.
Right.
And what that means is you've got these long chains of sugar that normal yeast can't get at. And that gives the chance for the wild, funky yeast that are slower acting to get in there and break down the stuff that the normal yeast can't.
Right. So it's a way of giving the wild stuff enough time to get in there and do its different crazy things.
Yeah, it's making people who start the party a bit slower. It's making sure there's something left over for them.
Yeah, you always want to be the last guy standing at a party.
And that is essentially Brett, which we will talk about again in a second. So you've got this turbid mash, loads of unfermentable sugar. You boil it with really old hops.
Right.
Or you don't want the bitterness from the hops or anything like this. So rather than using super fresh hops like we always talk about and drinking beers fresh, they age their hops so that there's no bitterness left. Just some antiseptic qualities that controls how quickly it sours. Because it's all about getting the balance of the right bacteria in that fermentation.
So it's sort of going back to that older use of hops, which was like almost like an antiseptic.
Yeah,
beers,
preservative, exactly.
Preservative.
So what we've now got is this turbid mashed, cool shipped beer that goes into wooden barrels. And that is where it turns into lambic. That's when we can start calling it a lambic, as it slowly ferments out and turns funky and sour, and we get all these really unusual characteristics. Shall we crack a beer and we can talk about what's going to happen?
Mate, I'd love to.
So let's get our party started, shall we?
Come on.
We're going to start with the gueuze from Fontainen, one of the great lambic brewers and blenders of what's called the Pajottenland. This is where these beers come from.
Not Narnia. It does sound like it's from Narnia, but it's from the Pajottenland.
So we've got these barrels filled with this turbid mashed, cool shipped beer, and it's slowly turning funky. It's like normal yeast goes to town, but also a trifecta of bacteria
Whoa.
and yeast as well. So we've got Brettanomyces, which is a different kind of yeast to normal brewer's yeast, and that adds, people say horse blanket, nobody knows what that means, but think barnyard, farmyard, think also like funky cider, if you've ever had like a real scrumpy cider.
Makes you sort of go...
Yeah, and can have some kind of pineapple-y notes as well, certain strains.
It's great,
quantities.
Brett. I mean, a beer that has it in spades is Orval. So, you know, maybe look to Orval to sort of get what that profile might
That
taste.
is very much that break character. You then got lactobacillus, which is what is used in these quick sours that's come in naturally.
Yes.
And that allowed lemoniness, yogurtiness, and of course sourness. So that, it converts sugars into lactic acid.
Wow.
And makes it turn sour.
So you get a kind of lemony freshness quality.
Exactly,
from that,
yeah.
Right.
And then you've also got Pediococcus, which does a similar thing to lactobacillus, but adds other additional flavours and also can turn a beer ropey in too big a quantities, which is where the beer basically turns to like gloop. It's pretty amazing to see. You've then got a fourth one, and it's one you only want in tiny, tiny quantities, and that's Acetobacter.
Okay.
And that is basically the bacteria that's used to make vinegar.
Right, I can see why you wouldn't want too much of
Exactly. So a little bit of it can be really nice, add depth, complexity, and like really like kind of sherbety sourness. But too much of it, and you've bottled some vinegar.
It's like when you're cooking, you just add a little bit of vinegar to anything. It just that wakes the flavour up, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So that is what's happening in these barrels. All of these bacteria and yeast are going to town and having fun. And how much of the funk character, or how much of the Brett character, or how much of just like the sweet residual character that was in there you want, depends on how long you age it.
Right.
So lambics can be aged for 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 years in barrel.
So this sort of different profiles of flavour would change and fluctuate over time as the different bacterias are influencing.
Exactly.
And coming into play and then going out of play.
Yeah, and really importantly, slowly reducing the amount of sugar. So the older it is, the less sweet it will be. That's the only super consistent thing that really happens.
Because they got to eat something.
They got to eat something, exactly. So we've got all these aged lambics that you can drink if you want. There's an amazing bar, La Mort Subite, Sudden Death bar in Belgium, where you can just drink it by the jug, basically.
Great
it's
name.
Just a flat cidery drink. Now, most of the lambic that's actually drunk is in different forms to that.
Okay.
When we think about lambic now, we're using that as an umbrella term for gueuze, framboise, kriek, and then all these other like really individual styles that have sort of cropped up, like dry hopped versions or nectarine versions or whatever it is. So what we've got in front of us is a gueuze.
Got you.
Now, a gueuze is a blend of young, teenage, and old lambic, generally.
Okay.
So 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambics are generally used in a gueuze. And they're blended, you know, usually majority it's young lambic.
Okay.
And then it's fermented in the bottle together, that blend, to create what we have here.
Wow.
In which we're going to get, hopefully, all of those characteristics we've just listed.
Such a great smelling beer.
So I'm getting Parmesan cheese.
Parmesan cheese, pepperiness,
Pepper.
lemon, like that kind of real zingy.
And a definite barnyard.
Erogenous almost.
Oh, blimey.
They in perfume they use a lot of those sort of compounds. A little bit of the sort of erogenous stuff to
Something a little bit naughty.
to bring out a kind of sexy vibe.
Okay. The party's taking a turn right now. And then on the palate, a vinegary tang, a lemony citrus note, but also, you know, a nice, it's not caramel, but it's there's a sweet syrupy viscosity to it that's cut through by really high carbonation.
My palate is literally tingling, like everything's going off.
Yeah, there's fireworks going off. Like these beers are, it's only 5.5%. It's incredibly sessionable, but it's heady. It's encompassing. It's just one of the most exciting things you can drink.
It's, I mean, it's just got a lovely sort of sherbety quality to it. The way that it fizzes on the tongue, the freshness, the sort of lemony freshness, that kind of herbal kind of pepperiness, the yogurtiness to it. I'm just salivating just thinking about it. It's great.
If Brad did tasting notes on cans, we'd need bigger cans. So what we're talking about blends, there's a little additional thing we need to talk about, which is the fact that there are lambic brewers.
Yes.
And there are lambic blenders.
Yes.
And then there are lambic brewers of blenders.
Right.
So
yeah.
not all of the people who release lambic in bottle, whether it's fruited, gueuze, or just straight up lambic, not all of them actually brew the beer. What happens is they're brewed at certain places, and then that wort, that turbid mash that's cool shipped, is bought and aged on site and blended by another brewery.
Even that's kind of mind blowing to just sort of think about a company, a blendery that don't brew the beer, but they take everyone else's and then they blend it. I guess it's a bit like a blended Scottish whiskey or something in that respect.
Almost exactly like that. And I think what it underlines is the fact that the really important thing is the blending, the quantities, and indeed the oaks that you're using, and indeed any fruits and stuff that you're adding. The actual turbid mash cool ship process should be relatively similar across all the brews. There are of course variations, like Oud Beer Cell, who don't produce any beer, they buy it all in from bone. They have a slightly hoppier wort than most people. That's part of their characteristic that they want. And there'll be subtle recipe changes across all of them, which is why a blendery like Tilquin, he takes from 5 different lambic brewers and then blends them all together. He's taking unique character and trying to make his own unique thing through all of those options.
It's a real collaborative community then. To make a blended thing, you have to work together, right?
Exactly, yeah. Which is when it gets a little bit political. So, all the beer that we're drinking here from Driefonteinen and all the beers that we've talked about as lambic are all from the Pajotton region, the Seine Valley, just southwest of Brussels.
Yeah.
Now, technically, you can make lambic anywhere in the world. People always talk about lambic being protected. The region is not protected. You can make lambic wherever you want, and you can call it lambic wherever you want.
Okay.
So long as you follow the processes of the amount of wheat, turbid mash, the cool ship process, and the blending. You can only call it Oud gueuze or Oud gueuze if it is fermented in the bottle.
Right, okay.
Okay? Now, there's lots of breweries outside of the lambic region that want to call their beer lambic, but out of respect for the traditions, the processes are millennia old, the traditions and the protections are decades old, some of these breweries are hundreds of years old. Out of respect, they don't call it lambic. Some call it lambic style, and the lambic brewers will be... Some will call it method traditionnel, which is a bit confusing because that's the champagne method. But lambic style, spontaneous, or a blend of 3 years, all this kind of stuff are ways that people try to say it's lambic, but we're not going to call it lambic.
Without stepping on their toes.
Yeah.
Nice.
So the protection isn't actually specific to that region, it's specific to the processes.
Got you. Right.
So which means, excitingly, that this style of brewing is done all over the world. And we are very, very lucky to have ourselves a bottle of Cool Ship Resurgam, which is the gueuze style, lambic style, blended, spontaneous...
Any other words, Johnny?
blonde beer. But anyway, so this is from Allagash, one of our favourite breweries in the world, and they make sensational spontaneous beer as well. So what hopefully we're going to see from this is that while the processes are the same, there is kind of a reason that the Belgian brewers are so protective. It's because the bacteria and the yeasts and indeed the ingredients that go into this are different to this. So this is made in exactly the same way.
Exactly the same way. All the processes are the same. Wow.
So this is where we get to talk about terroir in beer. So not only in the ingredients from an entirely different place, but the actual bacteria that's going in are entirely different.
Yes.
So same process, different ingredients. What do we get that's different?
I mean, it's totally different on the nose.
Yeah. I get candied lemon, chicory, like a kind of bitter, aromatic kind of thing.
There's a freshness to it that's different, and I can't quite pin it down.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's fruity rather than funky, but it also seems kind of drier as well at the same time.
Yeah.
So it's just a completely different aroma, but with exactly the same processes, and that's what I find amazing. And that's why lambic, even if it's not protected by region, is different, and that's why they insist upon it. Let's give it a go. Wow.
Different parts of my palate are firing off. It's still massively exciting.
Interestingly, I get stone fruit from that. I get like apricot or peach kind of yogurt vibes, then loads of lemon acidity. There's a definite higher hop character there as well. There is bitterness there, of which there's none
Yeah.
in the Driefonteinen one. So yeah, it's candied lemon, apricot. Yeah, how good does that sound? It's like a fruit salad.
It's great. I mean, it's so fresh to drink.
Yeah.
It's almost like summer captured in a glass for me, this.
Absolutely. But then there's a lovely finish on it because there's that hot bitterness, but there's also a little bit of oak to it. And generally with lambic beers, they don't want huge oak character. In fact, they tend to use barrels over and over and over and over and over again for two reasons. One is because obviously that bacteria gets imbued into that wood.
Yep.
But two, because each time you use it, you'll get less oak character.
Woody.
Exactly. Yeah. Whereas in this one, there's just a little hint of oak on the finish, which I quite like. It dries it out quite nicely. It's a much crisper finish. So there's always been all this politics about whether you can call it lambic or whether you can't. And really, it's kind of should you. I think that, there's so many similarities between these two beers, but in terms of the actual flavours, I'd rather this wasn't called lambic because it is demonstrably
It's its own thing.
Yeah,
it's its own animal.
And that's what's such a joy about lambic beer. Wherever you make it, it's going to be different. It's not like normal brewing, clean brewing, where you're all buying the same American hops with some farm differences, where you're buying the same grain with some farm differences or malting differences. We're all using the same yeast from the same yeast factories. And the water, even if we draw it from our own wells, often we're adding different chemicals to it. We're treating the water. So, to some extent, particularly IPA brewing is about making it all taste the same. Whereas lambic, you have none of that control.
It's kind of about homogenising everything and being totally in control as a brewer. Whereas this is opening it up to nature a bit more and allowing nature to come in and rewild it in a way. And that makes these two things, which have got ostensibly the same process, fundamentally different.
We've spent hundreds of years trying to wrestle fermentation under our control, this natural process under our control. But actually, increasingly, craft beer is starting to go, but what if we just step away?
Let it go.
Yeah, and we've seen it with natural wine. Natural cider's starting to come back in a big way in the UK and in America, and we're starting to go, you know what, nature, for certain things, knows exactly what it needs to do. And all we need to do is give it a little nudge.
And that is something that you can't find anywhere else in beer. And it's a beautiful thing, Johnny.